Fellow Burks and Cutters, this is an episode about the Fraternity of Order, also known as the Governors. I'd have to start out by saying that I'm not really as comfortable with the Reagan-Nixon law and order type world, which is why I put off these guys for quite a while. If I had to make a choice, I would probably choose the chaos side of things, but it's time to get the order triad out of the way, and what better place to start than with the Governors. But that's really in keeping with the way that Planescape does things, because it's about your subjective experience. That's what you hear, not about what is objectively true from an omniscient narrator. The Governors control Sigel's courts, but also its records, its histories, and generally all of the civil bureaucracy of a modern state. How exactly is Sigil run? It doesn't really feel exactly like it's some sort of medieval theocratic society, but more like an Enlightenment or even Victorian-era semi-modern bureaucratic system. With the rise of the Enlightenment and industrialization in Europe, two classes of people came to prominence. One were the scientists, who believed that the world is controlled by natural laws, and that they could study and discover how the world behaves through those natural laws using the scientific method. The second was a sort of bureaucratic technocracy who believed they could harness modern means and science to turn the chaos, or liberty, of modern man into a kind of mass-produced system that could solve social problems. And Planescape takes those two groups, which the Governors embody, and takes them to a third level to say that philosophically, morally, and cosmically, we can find laws by studying nature and how things work in order to determine the moral and cosmic order of the multiverse. Abiding again by the rule of three, the Governors have broken down the very functioning of the galaxy into three different groups or forms of the law in capital letters. First are rules. These are man-made laws, such as don't steal things, don't commit arson, don't commit murder. These are the lowest level of laws that you can study. Next up are the true laws, the laws made by the gods, judging the functioning of the multiverse. And these are very simple, similar to scientific principles, such as matter cannot be created or destroyed, or every action has an equal and opposite reaction, things like that. And the final one are the axioms. These are ones that the multiverse itself perhaps creates. Is the multiverse sentient? Nobody knows. But an axiom which is very difficult to understand or even define is what the Governors are trying to discover. Because if these things which even the gods themselves have to abide by can be discovered, then that would lead you to untold power. Oddly enough, the Governors do not like to say usually the creation of laws, because in their mind they're not really creating the law. What they're doing is discovering a law that already exists. Sort of like how a painter might poetically say that he didn't carve a sculpture, but he found the piece within the sculpture that he's carving out. So why should we spend so much time trying to study the law of the way the world works, how the ordered, rigid rules that the universe itself operates on? Simple, because knowledge is power, the same thing that drives so many other classes and factions in this world. They're trying to understand things, to learn things, and they believe by understanding the immutable laws of how everything follows, that they'll understand how the way the world works, because they're trying to define it. This is an ancient part of fantasy literature. Even in the fairy tale Rumpelstiltskin, think of what happens. You have to learn how to control this magical creature by knowing its name. Because if you know something's name, you can define it. And if you can define it, you can know everything about it. And you can start from that point to learn how to control it, how it's made, how it can be unmade, and how you can get around it. It frequently appears in D&D and other fantasy worlds that you have to learn a fiend's name. You have to learn what their true name is. And the true name even makes its way into Planescape Torment, the video game, where it's an important part of the entire story. And the theory that the Governors operate on is if you know the law, then you can know the loophole of the law. If you know how everything works and how everything runs and how everything functions, then, and only then, can you figure out a way around that law and figure out a way to skirt around it. Say you're trying to walk to a city and you're trying to figure out what the path is. Well, if you define what the path is, that means that you can define the shortcut from that path to the city. Magic, in a way, is a kind of universal loophole to reality that a lot of the arcanists inside of the governor world try to study their entire lives. A gigantic loophole in the law. And they learn it by studying the way the law works. You can learn it, and you can learn how to break it. It's two sides of the same coin. The governors are clearly the most scholarly of all the classes, the ones that are most adapted to being wizards. It was actually founded a millennia ago by wizard guilds that came from the Prime to Sigil. Being a wizard is perfectly adapted to a guild that's based on research, study, long hours spent in libraries, maybe tinkering with different alchemist sets, although you can't really be a chaotic sorcerer, that's not quite the same thing, but arcane magic is a very important part of their world. Experimenting in an alchemist lab isn't exactly an exciting part of gameplay for most people. Think of it sort of like Harry Potter being stuck in the potions class rather than off adventuring in one of the more exciting classes. But you can easily rewrite the governor that you're playing to be an Indiana Jones type of scholar who's brilliant and a professor, but he goes on exciting adventures like the librarians to go discover weird artifacts. A great thing about the governors is that they actually have a number of bases in every single one of the planes, even the nasty ones, the dark ones, in the hells, and you can really find them anywhere, studying, discovering, finding things, and it's very, very useful for the player character or his party. Wizards are the most common governors. Fighters would be pretty normal. Maybe a monk, because they're so lawful, would like being in there, even though they're more wisdom rather than intelligence-based. A rogue or a bard, I don't think necessarily would work very well for that class, because they're a little bit too chaotic and law-breaking to enjoy that, and obviously a barbarian needs to be chaotic, so he's really out. But the wizards are probably your best bet for being a governor. The fraternity is best summed up with the lawful neutral, or pure lawful alignment, where they see good and evil as unnecessary distractions to their pursuit of pure lawfulness. In fact, Mechanus, the purely lawful plane of the Modrons, is actually the home plane of the governors. Now, if you want to join the faction, there are plenty of people that join it and remain just as the namers, the lowest rank, because they want to be tied into the power and civil bureaucracy that the governors control. But they can't really move up there if they're just there to try to gain power, you know? And that suits them just fine. They may just want to control things and, run things in a very mild way just to be bureaucrats. But to really rise through the ranks, you have to be a true contributor to the understanding of the laws of the world. Whether that means you're a scholar, whether you're reading tons of books about the planes, finding weird artifacts, going on archaeological missions, making things in an alchemist lab, or whatever that entails, you have to increase their understanding of the laws of the planes. As with all the factions, you can play them in interesting, anachronistic ways. For instance, you can play a governor that believes that studying how chaos works and the functioning of chaos is actually the truest way to be a governor, because studying chaos, they might believe, like in the plane of limbo, and how it functions, is the ultimate dark of the universe. The laws governing the lawless. That would be an odd way to play a governor. They actually believe that even chaos has its own laws somehow functioning it, and that those people that believe in chaos are just fools that don't actually know the secret laws surrounding chaos and how the world really functions. Now, it hurts my chaotic soul to say this, but there's actually a lot of good things about the governors. You can't have a group of that many wizards of truly brilliant intelligence together without achieving something, and they do learn tons and tons of things about how the world works. They are the smartest of all the factions, that's pretty clear. And they're also laser-like focused with studying and scholarship as the most obvious way to advancement, and that makes a lot of sense to me. Discovering all of these things is simply enlightening. It's very, very important to learn things. You need an education to know the world. Why doesn't that make sense? And if you're a governor, you also get to speak legalese. And legal speak is this weird, arcane speech that you can't even understand through magical spells. You have to be a governor to understand what's going on. This weird mixture of ancient legal terminology that really allows you to control things if your party ever gets stuck in some sort of legal situation. And if your party's in legal trouble and you can talk your way out of it rather than fighting, that can be really useful. And it could also be very, very powerful if you have to go up against a brick wall of Sigillian bureaucracy. for most characters outside of the governors, it is forever going to be a monolith of unpleasantness, this bureaucratic, technocratic nightmare of wizards that control everything. But if you have a governor in your party, you can crack right through that because he knows the inner workings of how things function. And all chaotic joking aside, if you want a truly lawless society like the anarchists or the chaositecs do, go to Dark Age Europe or go to Somalia. It's not a fun place. There's lots of violence, lots of crime, obviously, and it's pretty unpleasant. We do need some laws and some obvious order to things, even on a limited extent, in order to run society. The bad side of the governors is easy for a bleaker like me to see. Their attempt to bring order into chaos can easily lead to a nightmare of Byzantine absurdities that harm the individual and profit no one. Getting obsessed with the bureaucracy itself, rather than what the bureaucracy is supposed to be doing, is the reason that bureaucracy is considered a pejorative word nowadays, rather than what it really should be, which is sort of a good thing. A way to order everything can lead to chaos itself, oddly enough. The more ridiculous and absurdly complicated the rules are, the more chaos you're going to create, because you're not going to be able to get everything done if everything is defined to the nth degree. Chaos insists that the rules and their attempt to make them is doomed to failure in some ways, and it's always going to create chaos in the midst of order, and you're doomed to die if you're living in a rigid, sclerotic bureaucracy and can't break out of old ideas to find new ones, which sometimes chaos can facilitate. And that's just when a faceless, cold bureaucracy goes awry, when the system itself is not functioning correctly. That's when some bad things can happen. But what if you have an evil character, a lawful evil character who deliberately misuses the law to harm others? That can be horrible, especially if that person gets higher up into the power system of Sigil. That is one of the few occasions when the Harmonium and the Mercy Killers, the traditional allies of the governors, can turn against them. Additionally, who's to say that there's any real answer to the universe? And really, what's the point of trying to find ultimate law without including good and evil in there? What's the point of all of this scientific or magical inquiry if there's really no moral judgment behind it? Are you really going to learn anything or how to treat other people better? The act of defining, as I mentioned before, is actually quite strong. But as with slavery, when you take control over someone else, you also impose yourself into a box. You put yourself in chains when you put someone else in chains when you try to define something. The box they are in is also the box you are in, and you may find yourself trapped in a never-ending quest to understand the law, when really the law is fundamentally absurd, and you may find yourself locked outside of a door in an unapproachable and ineffable universe, forever searching to understand something when really what you were trying to do is playing by the universe's rules to understand it, when it is completely a stone wall that you can never really get through in your life.
Before the law, there stands a God. A man comes from the country begging admittance to the law, but the God cannot admit him. Can he hope to enter at a later time? That is possible, says the God. The man tries to peer through the entrance. He had been taught that the law should be accessible to every man. Now, before he dies, all his experience condenses into one question, a question he has never asked. He beckons to the God. Says the God, you are insatiable. What is it now? Says the man, every man strives to attain the law. How is it then that in all these years, no one else has ever come here seeking admittance? His hearing has failed, so the God yells into his ear, no one else but you could ever have obtained admittance. No one else could enter this door. This door was intended only for you. And now, I am going to close it.
The allies of the Fraternity of Order are pretty obvious. They form the triad of order along with the Harmonium and the Mercy Killers. The governors come up with the laws, the Harmonium enforces the laws, the police, and the Mercy Killers punish the criminals in the prisons and act as bounty hunters. The Harmonium is probably best off not concocting the laws themselves and merely taking the laws that the governors make, and it diffuses out the power among the three groups and keeps sigils somewhat stable, which is very helpful for everyone. As I mentioned earlier, it is possible, however, for the mercy killers who tend towards a sort of lawful, maybe a little bit lawful evil, depending on which ones you're talking about, and the Harmonium who are lawful good, they can sometimes clash with the pure law of the governors, but that's usually pretty rare. Now, the enemies of the governors are pretty obvious, too. The Revolutionary League and the Chaositecs. The Chaositecs are the embodiment of chaos. The governors are the embodiment of law. Of course, they're not going to get along with one another and just fundamentally are at odds and dislike one another very strongly. The anarchists are also probably more directly involved in fighting against the hardheads, the Harmonium, because they're the police and they're the enforcers of law. But the governors represent the system itself and create and perpetuate the system that the anarchists despise. So they really hate the governors part and parcel with the Harmonium and the Mercy Killers. The Bleak Cabal are a little bit too chaotic. They need to be chaotic to be in that faction, so they're probably not too fond of the authorities, and the governors probably don't like these weird guys that don't give a damn about their authority, exercising their own control in the hive, the lowest part of the city. Also, the Sensates, probably some of the Sensates that are a little bit more dreamy and emotional and chaotic, are not going to get along well with the governors, who are more rigid and stuffy, and they're stuffed shirts. Overall, the governor's role in Sigil is a very powerful one, as they're tied in directly into the power and control of the system, and in many ways represent the system itself. So they are very prominent in the running of the city, because they're responsible for running a hell of a lot of it. So once again, we have a faction that is all about law versus chaos rather than good versus evil, and knowledge discovery, which is a lot more interesting to me than good versus evil ever could be. I'll never get along with the governors because they represent the man, and I represent chaos, I'm against the man. But you gotta hand it to them. They are industrious, intelligent, and they do a damn good job trying to run the city. I'm not necessarily saying they're succeeding, but they definitely try hard. And if you can learn the laws of the universe and how it functions, it's like learning how any kind of machine functions. You can control it, and you can get very, very powerful, even if you have to be a bowler hat wearing tweed-covered bureaucrat.
We didn't choose to be bureaucrats. No, that's what Almighty Jah made us. We treat people like swine and make them stand in line, even if nobody paid us. They say the world looks down on the bureaucrats. They say we're anal, compulsive, and weird. But when push comes to shove, you gotta do what you love, even if it's not a good idea.